Thank you. We'd like to start by thanking Dominique and all of the organizers of the seminar for inviting us to present the paper. And our colleague, Ralph Clem, is unable to be here, but he sends his regrets. Cindy and I are going to do our best to represent him. And if we could have the presentation loaded. No, it's not. That's not ours. Thank you. So this paper is part of a larger project that addresses how states bordering hostile powers, like Ukraine bordering Russia, maintain state capacity. Now, much of the literature on state capacity emphasizes either coercive or extractive powers. Coercive powers being military and security, managing the borders and internal order, or extractive powers, the ability to generate revenue through taxation. We instead focus on bureaucratic state capacity, the idea that states provide essential services to citizens. And we've already had one paper at the seminar on this topic, Sophie's on water infrastructure in Donbas. We instead focus on healthcare, on education, and on election administration. The paper that we're presenting here focuses only on healthcare and focuses on it only in Donbas. We're interested, in addition to documenting state capacity, understanding its connection to legitimacy, the notion that citizens are willing to be governed by those who claim authority. And we believe that there is a connection, and we intend down the line to assess this connection between state capacity and legitimacy. So the project today addresses two things. One is the objective measures of the war, how infrastructure has been damaged. And the second is perceptions. We begin to talk about blame attribution in the paper. It's an issue that we will explore more in future papers. And we don't talk about media coverage here, but if you plan to be in Boston at ASIS and come to our panel, you can hear what we have to say about media coverage there. So before talking about the data, I just want to state a few points, few contextual points. First, in the discussion of the Donbas War, there has been a conventional wisdom that it began with some kind of hybrid war. And we want to dispense with the notion that hybrid war really characterizes what's happening in the Donbas. It's a kinetic war. Really, for understanding what's happening in Donbas, it's an outdated concept. The second point is that we acknowledge that the Donbas conflict would not have occurred without Russian intervention. But tactical decisions by individuals in the field have caused healthcare infrastructure damage, and we can ascribe those both to the Ukrainian side as well as to the Russian or to the insurgent side. The third point is that in some conflicts around the world, medical facilities have been intentionally targeted. We will talk about a couple of cases where the evidence suggests that's been the case in Ukraine, but largely damage to healthcare infrastructure has come from area effects weapons, so these are not precision targeted weapons. And the fourth and last point is that as we began this project, we started to discover that medical care infrastructure damage has been far greater than was initially reported. And I'm going to hand the microphone over to Cindy. She's going to talk about the process of constructing this data and what we found.
Here we go. So just a little bit about the data and the methods that we utilized for this problem. I think, interestingly enough, Dominique, well organized. It brings up several legacies from our previous panel today, which is how do you trace instances of violence, and how do we locate them both in time as well as in geographic space. And so what we started out with, again, as Eric pointed out, prompted by particularly reports coming out of Syria about the Syrian Air Force as well as the Russian Air Force targeting medical locations, about increasing reports from civil conflict in Africa, pointing to purposeful destructions of medical facilities, as well as just completely anecdotal evidence gathered by my colleagues at UNHCR, about refugees coming out of Donbas even after ceasefires have been signed, citing the lack of access to medical facilities as a major reason of their exodus from the region. Thinking about this, we started focusing on media. What could we learn from press reports, both in the central press for Ukraine as well as the central Russian press? We had unique access to a series of 12 different newspapers that have been published in Donetsk and Luhansk after 2014, and a large number of international reports from UN agencies as well as press reports in major American and British newspapers. Hundreds of hours reading some pretty turgid prose came up with an enormous number of reports of different hostilities that had, or different interactions in which medical facilities had been shelled. Many of them were very general. A hospital in a village, this hospital in Luhansk, or a hospital in Donetsk. What we were interested in is where did we get precise information that told us the name of the hospital or the number of the hospital so that we could geolocate them. We ended up geolocating 247 registered hospitals and clinics in the region, right? And once we got those, we double-checked that with a list from the Ministry of Health in Ukraine for a list of medical facilities from 2013 to make sure that these were indeed registered clinics or hospitals. And what we found is that nearly a third of them had been shelled between 2014 and August of this year. This is slightly lower than the WHO estimate for a slightly shorter time period, and we're going to attribute that to the fact that WHO has been counting reports that can't be geolocated. So we are very conservative in terms of the way that we have identified targets. And not surprisingly, we find that the attacks on hospitals reported damage to medical infrastructure of any sort, right? So some of these are like the Vishnevsky Hospital in Donetsk, which has been completely turned into rubble. Some of them are simply cases where hospital windows have been blown out. We see that it really follows the line of contact quite clearly, with two exceptions, as Eric pointed out, in Slavyansk and Mariupol. And of course, there's a temporal effect. Here we see the vast majority of the reports for hospitals and medical care facilities we were able to geolocate. Most of them occur in 2014, but they continue well after ceasefire agreements have been made. And in two cases, we seem a little bit more confident in the attribution of blame. The first is in the area of Slavyansk, and the horrible shelling that has been associated with the railway hospital in Liman. This has typically been associated with rockets launched by Ukrainian forces. In other places, it's not clear. Media reports point to insurgents and or Russian forces. In Mariupol, most of the press reports, and this includes even Russian press reports, attribute the shelling of medical infrastructure to Russian forces that had as you all know well, Mariupol has been a source of quite a lot of military contact over the last few years. And the damage to the hospitals here has been primarily attributed to Russian sources. A bit on blame. Our next paper will really focus on what can we learn from press reports about who instigates damage to medical infrastructure. As we all know, this goes against numerous UN agreements. This goes against all articles of war. Who has been at fault? It should surprise no one that, of course, when we look at the central Ukrainian press, there are more reports that can be attributed to Russian forces. In the Russian case, we get more reports that can be attributed to Ukrainian forces. What I found absolutely fascinating in our database is that there is not a great deal of convergence in terms of the reporting between Ukraine and Russia. Not only do they attribute blame differently, but they seem to pattern their reporting of damage to healthcare infrastructure based on the ability to blame the other. So we see several reports being discussed in multiple venues, but it's usually Ukrainian press, international press, Western press, maybe UN sources, Russian sources, and then UN sources. But it does seem very clearly that this is a highly weaponized source of information that has been used for propaganda by both Russian media sources as well as Ukrainian. And this is going to be a thread that we'll continue to pull on as we continue this work. Now, just as a bit of a teaser, we're not just looking at hospitals, we're also now building up our database about attacks on educational facilities. This has been particularly pernicious, and this is data from Human Rights Watch. In schools, it's been particularly difficult because while much of the shelling has been while school has been not in session, thankfully, there are increased reports that cut across the line of contact, pointing out that school infrastructure is being appropriated by military forces and being used for the storage of weaponry as well as the billeting of troops, which again raises substantial questions about the security for education moving forward in this region. In addition to education, we're also looking at polling places where people go to work. So in pulling on Erik's work on elections in Ukraine, what we're interested in looking at is to what extent do we find that conflict has led to the damage of polling places and led to the necessity of having to close down polling places, hindering the state's ability to hold open and accessible elections. And we've got quite a bit of findings on those things as well. So in general, of course, we need to, first of all, end the Donbas conflict, but we certainly, as we look at this historically, need to understand the implications of the war moving forward. Damage to humanitarian infrastructure gives us a unique and valuable window into thinking about not only how the state capacity is being viewed by people in Donetsk and Luhansk today, but what are the areas that will need to be triaged as states try to reclaim territory or establish themselves in that territory. This is our first step. It's cataloging the events. Assessing responsibility will be next on our agenda as we evaluate the reports of the healthcare infrastructure. And as we expand this work to education and elections, we're looking forward to using this unique and troubling situation in Ukraine to help us better understand the very multifaceted concept of state capacity. Thanks for your attention.